The steam whistle pierced the frozen air like a knife through silence, and Eleanor stepped onto the platform of Redemption Creek, Wyoming territory, clutching her worn leather suitcase as snow swirled around her boots in the fading light of December 1883. She had never felt cold like this before, not in Philadelphia where she had grown up in her aunt's boarding house, not even during the harsh winter of '79 when the Delaware River froze solid. This was different, a cold that seemed to reach inside her chest and squeeze her lungs until each breath became a deliberate act of survival. The platform was nearly empty, just a few stragglers hurrying toward the warmth of whatever shelter awaited them in this frontier town that looked more like a collection of weathered wooden boxes than an actual settlement. Eleanor set down her suitcase for just a moment to adjust her thin wool coat, the one her aunt had insisted would be sufficient for the journey west. Her fingers were already numb despite her gloves, and she could feel the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones after 3 days on the train. She had left Philadelphia with $27 sewn into the lining of her coat, a letter of introduction to a school board that might not even exist anymore, and the desperate hope that a teaching position in Wyoming would offer her something Philadelphia never could. A fresh start away from the scandal that had driven her from everything she knew. "That looks heavy, miss." The voice came from behind her, deep and warm despite the frigid air. Eleanor turned to find a man standing a respectful distance away, his hat pulled low against the snow but not low enough to hide the concern in his dark eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered beneath a heavy sheepskin coat, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who belonged to this harsh landscape in a way she never would. "I can manage, thank you," Eleanor said, her pride flaring up despite the fact that her arm already ached from carrying the suitcase through 3 train stations. She had learned the hard way that accepting help from men often came with expectations she had no intention of fulfilling. The cowboy, for that was clearly what he was based on, the worn leather chaps visible beneath his coat and the spurs that clinked softly when he shifted his weight, simply nodded. But he did not walk away. Instead, he stood there watching as she struggled to lift the suitcase, which seemed to have gained 20 pounds during her moment of rest. "The boarding house is a mile up the main road," he said quietly. "Storm is coming in fast. You will want to get there before full dark." Eleanor looked up at the sky, which had turned the color of old bruises, and felt her determination waver. She had no idea where the boarding house was. No map, no guide, and the few people who had been on the platform were already disappearing into the gathering dusk. The wind picked up, sending snow devils spinning across the frozen ground, and she shivered so hard her teeth chattered. "I appreciate the information," she managed to say through lips that were rapidly losing feeling. The cowboy tilted his head slightly, and she caught a glimpse of something that might have been amusement in his expression. "I am heading that direction myself. Would be no trouble to carry your bag." There was something in his voice, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough appearance, that made Eleanor's resistance crumble. She was cold, exhausted, and terrified, though she would have died before admitting the last part out loud. "That would be very kind," she heard herself say. He stepped forward and lifted her suitcase as though it weighed nothing at all. "Name is James Cartwright," he said, falling into step beside her as they started down the platform stairs. "Most folks call me Carter. Eleanor Whitmore," she replied, concentrating on not slipping on the icy steps. "Most folks call me Miss Whitmore." She caught the hint of a smile on his weathered face. He looked to be in his middle 20s, perhaps 26 or 27, with the sun-weathered skin of someone who spent his life outdoors and the calloused hands of a working man. There was a scar above his right eyebrow, a thin white line that disappeared into his hairline, and Eleanor found herself wondering about the story behind it before firmly pushing the curiosity aside. The main street of Redemption Creek was exactly as bleak as Eleanor had feared. A general store, a saloon with raucous laughter spilling out into the cold, a bank that looked more secure than the church next to it, and a scattering of other buildings that seemed to huddle together against the wind. Horses stood tied to hitching posts, their breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air, and a few men hurried past with their heads down and their collars turned up. Carter led her past the saloon without a glance, past the general store where warm light glowed in the windows, and toward a two-story building at the far end of the street that had a hand-painted sign reading Redemption House swinging in the wind. Mrs. Patterson runs the place, Carter explained as they climbed the front steps. She is particular about manners and expects rent paid on time, but she keeps a clean house and her cooking is the best in 3 counties. You live here? Eleanor asked, surprised. I have a room on the 2nd floor, Carter confirmed. Been here about 2 years now. Work the cattle ranch 5 miles north, but I like being in town when the work is done. Gets lonely out there in the winter. Before Eleanor could respond, the front door opened and a woman who could only be Mrs. Patterson appeared. She was in her 50s, Eleanor guessed, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that took in everything about Eleanor in a single sweeping glance. Carter, you are late for supper, Mrs. Patterson said, but there was affection in her tone. Then her eyes shifted to Eleanor. And who might this be? Eleanor Whitmore, ma'am, Eleanor said quickly, straightening her spine despite her exhaustion. I was told there might be a room available. I am here for a teaching position. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. Teaching position, you say? Well, come in out of this cold before you freeze solid. Carter, bring that bag inside and then wash up for supper. The warmth of the boarding house hit Eleanor like a physical force as she stepped across the threshold. A fire roared in a large stone fireplace in what appeared to be a common room, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread made her stomach clench with sudden hunger. She had not eaten since breakfast, a stale biscuit purchased at a train station in Nebraska, and that felt like a lifetime ago. The room is $4 a week, including breakfast and supper, Mrs. Patterson announced, leading Eleanor up a narrow staircase. Laundry is extra. No men allowed upstairs except Carter, and he knows better than to cause trouble. No drinking, no smoking, and no entertaining questionable company. That all sounds perfectly reasonable, Eleanor assured her, mentally calculating how long her $27 would last. She needed to find the school board immediately, needed to secure that teaching position before her money ran out. Mrs. Patterson opened a door at the end of the hallway, revealing a small but clean room with a narrow bed, a washstand, a wardrobe, and a window that looked out over the darkening street. Supper is in 20 minutes. I suggest you wash the train dust off and come down hungry. Carter appeared in the doorway with her suitcase, setting it down just inside the room with careful respect for the boundary between hallway and private space. Welcome to Redemption Creek, Miss Whitmore, he said, touching the brim of his hat before disappearing back down the hallway. Eleanor closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a long breath she had not realized she was holding. She had made it. Against all odds, despite her fears and the voice in her head that sounded distressingly like her Aunt Margaret insisting she would fail, she had actually made it to Wyoming territory. Now she just had to figure out how to survive here. The supper table at Redemption House was a revelation. Besides Mrs. Patterson, Carter, and Eleanor, there were 4 other boarders. An elderly man named Mr. Hoskins who worked at the bank, 2 brothers named Tom and Samuel who were prospecting for silver in the mountains, and a widow named Clara who helped at the general store. The food was as good as Carter had promised, thick beef stew with vegetables and bread so fresh it steamed when broken open, and Eleanor found herself eating with an appetite she had not felt in months. So you are here to teach, Clara said, her friendly face creasing with interest. We desperately need a teacher. The last one left 3 months ago to get married, and the children have been running wild ever since. Do you know where I might find the school board? Eleanor asked eagerly. That would be Reverend Walsh, Mayor Hutchins, and Doc Bradley, Mr. Hoskins supplied. They meet on Thursday afternoons at the church, but I imagine they would be happy to see you any time given the circumstances." "The circumstances," Eleanor echoed. There was an uncomfortable silence around the table. Finally, Carter spoke up, his voice careful. "There was some trouble a few weeks back. Some of the miners from up north came into town causing problems, and the schoolhouse got damaged in the commotion. It has been repaired now, but folks were worried about bringing in a new teacher until things settled down." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "What kind of trouble?" "Nothing you need to worry about now," Mrs. Patterson said firmly, shooting a quelling look around the table. "Those miners moved on, and Sheriff Dawson made it clear that kind of behavior would not be tolerated in Redemption Creek. You are perfectly safe here, Miss Whitmore." But Eleanor noticed the way Carter's jaw had tightened when the miners were mentioned. Noticed the way his hand had unconsciously moved toward his hip, where a gun belt would normally rest. She had grown up in a rough neighborhood in Philadelphia, had learned to read the signs of violence brewing beneath the surface, and she recognized those signs now. Redemption Creek might look like a quiet frontier town, but there were currents running beneath the surface that she did not yet understand. After supper, Eleanor helped Clara clear the dishes despite Mrs. Patterson's protests that guests did not work on their first night. The widow was kind, chattering easily about the town and its inhabitants as they worked, and Eleanor found herself relaxing slightly in the comfortable domesticity of the kitchen. "Carter is a good man," Clara said suddenly, catching Eleanor off guard. "I know he might seem rough around the edges, but he has a good heart. When my husband died last year and I could not afford the burial, Carter paid for it himself and never said a word to anyone. I only found out because Reverend Walsh let it slip." Eleanor was not sure how to respond to this information. That was very generous of him. "He is not the type to put on airs or pretend to be something he is not," Clara continued, scrubbing at a stubborn pot. "Around here, that counts for a lot. There are plenty of men who talk big but run at the first sign of real trouble. Carter is not one of them." Eleanor went to bed that night with her mind churning, thinking about cowboys who carried suitcases and paid for strangers' funerals, about damaged schoolhouses and departed miners, about the way Carter had looked at her on the platform with something in his eyes that might have been recognition, as though he understood what it meant to arrive somewhere new with nothing but hope and desperation in equal measure. The wind howled outside her window, rattling the glass, and she pulled the quilts up to her chin and tried not to think about how far she was from everything she had ever known. Morning came with pale winter sunlight and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. Eleanor dressed quickly in one of her 2 respectable dresses, a dark blue wool that had seen better days but was at least clean and modest, and pinned her chestnut hair into a neat bun at the nape of her neck. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the woman staring back. 3 days ago she had been Eleanor Whitmore, failed governess and social pariah. Now she was Eleanor Whitmore, frontier schoolteacher, and she had to make this work because there was nowhere left to run. Breakfast was oatmeal with dried fruit and thick cream, and Eleanor ate quickly, anxious to find the school board and secure her position. Carter was already gone, having left before dawn to work at the ranch, but Mr. Hoskins offered to walk her to the church and introduce her to Reverend Walsh. The town looked different in daylight, less menacing but no less raw. The buildings were weathered but sturdy, built to withstand the harsh winters and the occasional violence that seemed to be part of life on the frontier. People called out greetings to Mr. Hoskins as they walked, and Eleanor felt the weight of curious stares as word spread that the new teacher had arrived. Reverend Walsh was a thin man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. He listened intently as Eleanor presented her letter of introduction, which was actually a forged reference from a family in Philadelphia who had never employed her but whose name she had borrowed in desperation, and asked her several questions about her education and teaching philosophy. "You understand that this will not be easy," Reverend Walsh said finally. We have 23 children ranging from age 5 to 15. Some of them have never been inside a schoolroom. Their families are ranchers, miners, shopkeepers, all good people but practical ones who do not always see the value in book learning. I understand, Eleanor said, trying to project a confidence she did not entirely feel. I believe education is about more than books, Reverend. It is about teaching children to think clearly, to express themselves, to understand the world beyond their immediate experience. I may be from Philadelphia, but I am not here to impose Eastern ideas on Western children. I am here to help them become the best versions of themselves. Reverend Walsh smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen since arriving in Redemption Creek. When can you start? Tomorrow, if you need me to. Tomorrow it is then. The salary is $30 a month plus coal for the schoolhouse stove. We will provide teaching materials, though I warn you the selection is limited. School runs Monday through Friday, 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. Eleanor felt dizzy with relief. $30 a month was not much, but it was enough to pay her rent and feed herself with a little left over. She had done it. She had actually done it. She floated back to Redemption House feeling lighter than she had in months and spent the afternoon preparing for her first day of teaching. She had brought a few books with her, treasured volumes of poetry and literature that she had hidden at the bottom of her suitcase, and she laid them out carefully on the small table in her room, planning lessons and trying to imagine what frontier children would be like. Carter came back that evening covered in dust and smelling of horses and hay, and Eleanor found herself watching him at supper as he talked easily with the other boarders about cattle prices and winter feed. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet competence that she found strangely comforting. When he caught her looking, he smiled slightly, and Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks as she quickly looked away. After supper, she stepped outside onto the front porch to get some air, wrapping her shawl tightly against the cold. The sky was clear for the first time since her arrival, and the stars were so bright and numerous that they seemed to merge into a glowing river across the darkness. She had never seen stars like this in Philadelphia, where the city lights and coal smoke obscured the heavens. Beautiful, is it not? Eleanor jumped, not having heard Carter come out behind her. He stood a respectful distance away, his hands in his pockets, his breath creating clouds in the cold air. I have never seen anything like it, Eleanor admitted. One of the things I love about this country, Carter said. You can see forever out here. Makes you feel small, but in a good way, like your problems are not as big as you thought they were. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then found herself asking, "What brought you to Redemption Creek?" Carter was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I was running from something too. Everyone who comes out here is running from something or running toward something, and sometimes it is hard to tell the difference." "What were you running from?" Eleanor asked, emboldened by the darkness, and the strange intimacy of standing under the stars with someone who was essentially a stranger, but who somehow felt like the only person who might understand. "A war that would not let me go," Carter said quietly. "I was 17 when I enlisted, barely knew which end of a rifle to hold. By the time it was over, I had seen things that no man should see, done things I will carry to my grave. When I came home to Kansas, everyone wanted me to be the same boy I had been before, but that boy was gone. So I came west looking for a place where I could be someone new." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Did you find it?" "I am working on it," Carter said, and there was something in his voice, a vulnerability that made her want to reach out and touch his hand, to offer some kind of comfort. But she kept her hands wrapped in her shawl and stayed where she was. "I was engaged," Eleanor heard herself say, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "To a man my aunt approved of, a businessman with a respectable income and a house in a good neighborhood. I thought I loved him, or at least I thought I could learn to love him. Then I found out he was already married, had a wife and 3 children in New York that no one in Philadelphia knew about. When I confronted him, he laughed and said I should be grateful he was willing to keep me as his mistress since I had no other prospects. "What did you do?" Carter asked. I told my aunt everything. She did not believe me, called me a liar and a troublemaker, and said I had probably encouraged him. Within a week, everyone in our social circle knew some version of the story, but in every version, I was the villain. The woman who tried to steal another woman's husband. The desperate spinster who made up stories for attention. I lost my position as a governess because no respectable family would employ me. I could not find work anywhere in Philadelphia, so I came here, to a place where no one knows me and no one cares about Philadelphia gossip. "I am sorry that happened to you," Carter said, and the simple sincerity in his voice made Eleanor's eyes sting with tears she had been holding back for months. "Thank you for carrying my suitcase yesterday," she said, changing the subject before she started crying. "I do not know what I would have done if you had not helped me." "You would have figured it out," Carter said with quiet confidence. "You are the type who always figures it out." Eleanor went to bed that night feeling something she had not felt in a long time, a cautious flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she could start over. The schoolhouse was a simple wooden building with rows of benches, a wood stove, and a chalkboard that had seen better days. Eleanor arrived early on her first day, her stomach churning with nerves, and spent an hour arranging the space and preparing her materials. The children began arriving at 8 o'clock, shepherded by parents who looked at Eleanor with varying degrees of skepticism and hope. They were a motley group, these frontier children. The youngest was a tiny girl named Lily who could barely reach the bench when she climbed up on it. The oldest was a 15-year-old boy named Jacob who was already taller than Eleanor and looked like he would rather be anywhere else. In between were children of all sizes and temperaments, some eager and bright-eyed, others sullen and resistant. Eleanor took a deep breath and began. "Good morning. My name is Miss Whitmore and I am honored to be your teacher. I know that some of you have been in school before and some of you have not. I know that some of you want to be here and some of you do not, but we are all here now, so let us make the best of it." The first week was brutal. Eleanor had never worked so hard in her life, trying to teach reading to children who had never held a book, while simultaneously keeping the older students engaged with more advanced material. Jacob proved to be her biggest challenge, alternating between sullen silence and outright defiance, and Eleanor went home each night exhausted and questioning every decision she had made. But there were bright spots too. Lily turned out to be brilliant, soaking up letters and numbers like a sponge absorbing water. A 9-year-old girl named Sarah had a gift for storytelling that left Eleanor breathless. And gradually, even Jacob began to soften, especially after Eleanor started bringing in newspapers and asking the older students to discuss current events, treating them like the young adults they were becoming rather than unruly children. Carter made a habit of walking Eleanor to and from the schoolhouse when his work schedule allowed. At first, she protested that it was not necessary, but he pointed out that he passed the school on his way to town anyway, and it was no trouble. The truth was that Eleanor looked forward to those walks, to the easy conversation that flowed between them as they discussed everything from local politics to literature to their shared love of the mountains that rose in the distance like jagged teeth against the sky. "Have you ever been up there?" Eleanor asked one afternoon in early January, gesturing toward the peaks. "Many times," Carter said. "In the summer, the high meadows are full of wildflowers. It is the most beautiful thing you ever saw." "I would like to see that someday," Eleanor said wistfully. "I could take you," Carter offered, then seemed to realize how forward that sounded. "I mean when the weather clears, in the spring, if you wanted. Mrs. Patterson could come as a chaperone." Eleanor smiled at his sudden awkwardness, finding it endearing. "I would like that very much." As winter deepened, Eleanor found herself settling into the rhythms of life in Redemption Creek. She had her students, her room at Redemption House, her growing friendship with Clara and Mrs. Patterson, and her increasingly complicated feelings for Carter. Because they were complicated, no matter how much she tried to tell herself they were just friends. She found herself watching for him at breakfast, listening for his voice in the hallway, making excuses to linger on the porch in the evening hoping he might come out and talk to her under the stars. It was Clara who finally called her on it. They were doing laundry together on a Saturday morning in late January, hauling water and scrubbing clothes until Eleanor's hands were raw, when Clara said casually, "Carter is half in love with you, you know." Eleanor nearly dropped the sheet she was wringing out. "What, Carter?" Clara repeated patiently. "He is half in love with you, maybe more than half. Everyone in the boarding house has noticed." "That is ridiculous," Eleanor said, but her heart was pounding. "He is just being kind." "Carter is kind to everyone," Clara agreed. "But he does not look at everyone the way he looks at you. He does not rearrange his entire schedule to walk everyone to work. He does not ask Mrs. Patterson what your favorite foods are so he can make sure there are extra servings at supper." "He does that?" Eleanor asked weakly. Clara laughed. "You really have not noticed?" "Eleanor, the man is smitten. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Eleanor had no answer. Part of her wanted to run away from anything that even resembled romantic attachment after the disaster with her former fiancé. But another part of her, a part that was growing stronger every day, wanted to lean into the warmth that Carter offered, to let herself believe that maybe not all men were liars and manipulators, that maybe she deserved someone who looked at her like she was something precious. The decision was taken out of her hands 2 weeks later, when trouble came to Redemption Creek in the form of 5 men on horseback riding hard into town on a Tuesday afternoon. Eleanor was just dismissing her students when she heard the gunshots, sharp cracks that sent birds exploding from the trees and made her heart leap into her throat. "Everyone stay inside," Eleanor commanded, pushing the younger children away from the windows. Through the glass, she could see people running, could hear shouting and more gunshots, and fear turned her blood to ice. Jacob stood up, his young face set in grim lines. "That is the Barlow gang. They have been raiding ranches north of here. My father warned us they might come to town." "You are staying right here," Eleanor said firmly, blocking the door. "All of you, no one leaves until I say it is safe." The next hour was the longest of Eleanor's life. She kept the children calm by having them recite poems and practice their multiplication tables, all while her ears strained to make sense of the chaos outside. There were more gunshots, the sound of breaking glass, men shouting, and then, finally, a terrible silence. Eleanor waited another 10 minutes before cautiously opening the schoolhouse door. The main street was a disaster. The windows of the general store were shattered, the bank door hung at an awkward angle, and there was blood on the street outside the saloon. But the 5 riders were gone, and people were emerging from their hiding places, calling out to check on each other. Eleanor released the children to their frantic parents and then stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, shaking with delayed reaction. Where was Carter? He had been working at the ranch, but surely he would have heard the gunshots, would have come to town to help. Unless he was hurt. Unless he was lying somewhere bleeding while she stood here useless and afraid. Eleanor. She spun around to find Carter running toward her, and the relief was so intense it nearly knocked her off her feet. Without thinking, she ran to meet him, and then his arms were around her, and she was holding on to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned liquid and unstable. "Are you hurt? Were any of the children hurt?" Carter demanded, his hands running over her arms and shoulders as though checking for injuries. "We are fine. We stayed inside. Carter, what happened?" "Barlow gang," he said grimly, echoing Jacob's earlier words. "They hit the bank and the general store. Sheriff Dawson got one of them, but the others got away. They took about $300 and shot Mr. Hoskins when he tried to stop them." Eleanor gasped. "Is he alive but badly hurt?" "Doc Bradley is with him now." Carter's arms tightened around her. "I was at the ranch when we heard the shots. I have never ridden so fast in my life. All I could think was that you were here, that something might have happened to you, and He stopped, seeming to realize how tightly he was holding her, and started to pull away. Eleanor held on. "Do not let go," she whispered. "Please." So he did not. They stood there in the middle of the street while people rushed around them dealing with the aftermath of violence. And Eleanor let herself take comfort in the solid warmth of Carter's body, in the steady beat of his heart against her ear, in the knowledge that he had ridden hard through danger because he was worried about her. That night, Redemption House was somber. Mr. Hoskins had survived surgery but was in grave condition. The town was organizing a posse to go after the Barlow gang, and Carter announced at supper that he would be riding out with them in the morning. "Absolutely not," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. Carter looked at her in surprise. "They shot Mr. Hoskins. They could have hurt innocent people, could have hurt children. Someone has to stop them. And it has to be you." Eleanor demanded, aware that everyone at the table was watching them but unable to stop the words from pouring out. "You could be killed." "I will be careful," Carter said quietly. "You cannot promise that. You do not know what will happen out there." Carter reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture so intimate and so public that Eleanor heard Clara's soft gasp. "I need to do this, Eleanor. These men will keep hurting people until someone stops them. I have to try." Eleanor wanted to argue more, wanted to forbid him from going, but she could see the determination in his eyes and knew it would do no good. Instead, she squeezed his hand and said, "Then you have to promise to come back." "I promise," Carter said, and Eleanor chose to believe him because the alternative was unbearable. The posse rode out at dawn, 8 men including Carter and Sheriff Dawson, all armed and grim-faced. Eleanor stood on the porch of Redemption House with Mrs. Patterson and Clara, watching until they disappeared into the gray morning light, and then she went to teach her students because she did not know what else to do. The next 3 days were agony. Eleanor threw herself into her work, drilling the children in rating and arithmetic, until even the most enthusiastic students began to flag. At night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound outside her window and praying to a God she was not sure she believed in to keep Carter safe. Mr. Hoskins died on the 2nd day, and the town held a somber funeral service that Eleanor attended with red eyes and a heart full of grief for a kind old man who had welcomed her to Redemption Creek and asked for nothing in return. The posse returned on the 4th day, exhausted and battered but alive. Eleanor was in the schoolhouse when she heard the commotion, and she made herself finish the lesson she was teaching even though every instinct screamed at her to run outside and see if Carter was among them. When she finally dismissed the children and stepped out into the afternoon sun, she found him waiting for her, leaning against the schoolhouse wall with dried blood on his shirt and a bruise darkening his left cheekbone. "We got them," he said simply. "All 5 of them are in custody. They will hang for what they did." Eleanor closed the distance between them and touched his face gently, her fingers ghosting over the bruise. "You are hurt. It is nothing. The other fellow looks worse." He caught her hand and pressed it against his cheek, his eyes searching her face. "I told you I would come back." "I know," Eleanor whispered, "but I was still terrified." "Eleanor," Carter said, and there was something in his voice that made her breath catch. "I need to tell you something. When I was out there chasing those men, all I could think about was getting back here." "Getting back to you? I have been trying to be respectful, trying to give you space and not push too hard because I know you have been hurt before. But I cannot keep pretending that what I feel for you is just friendship." Eleanor's heart was hammering so hard she could barely hear him over the rushing in her ears. "What do you feel?" "I love you," Carter said, and the simple honesty of it nearly broke her. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you on that train platform looking fierce and terrified all at once. I love the way you talk to your students like they matter. I love the way you see the best in everyone, even people who do not deserve it. I love the way you are not afraid to argue with me when you think I am wrong. I love everything about you, and I know it has only been 2 months and maybe it is too soon, but I almost died out there and all I could think was that I should have told you while I had the chance." "Carter," Eleanor said. And then she was kissing him, pulling him down to her because she was tired of being careful, tired of protecting herself from hurt by refusing to feel anything at all. His arms came around her and he kissed her back with a desperation that matched her own. And for just a moment, the world narrowed to the two of them and nothing else mattered. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor pressed her forehead against his and said, "I love you too." "I did not want to, I tried not to, but I do. I love you so much it terrifies me." "Then be terrified with me," Carter said, his hands cupping her face like she was something infinitely precious. "We can be terrified together." The rest of the winter passed in a blur of happiness that Eleanor had never imagined possible. Carter courted her properly, with Mrs. Patterson serving as a strict but indulgent chaperone on walks and Sunday afternoon visits. He brought her wildflowers that somehow survived in the snow, carved her a beautiful bookmark from a piece of cedar wood, and sat through poetry readings in Mrs. Patterson's parlor with every evidence of sincere interest, even though Eleanor suspected he would have preferred to be anywhere else. In return, Eleanor taught him to appreciate literature, mended his clothes with tiny, careful stitches, and learned everything she could about cattle ranching and the rhythms of frontier life. She met his friends from the ranch, good men who teased him mercilessly about being besotted but clearly approved of Eleanor. She learned to ride a horse, badly at first and then with increasing confidence, until Carter declared her competent enough for the trip to the high meadows he had promised her. In April, when the snow finally melted and the first green shoots began pushing up through the mud, Carter asked Eleanor to marry him. He did it properly, kneeling in Mrs. Patterson's parlor with the older woman beaming in the doorway, offering Eleanor a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. "It is not much," he said nervously. "When I have more saved, I will get you something better, something with a stone. It is perfect," Eleanor interrupted, her vision blurring with tears. "It is absolutely perfect, and yes, I will marry you." They were married in June in the small church where Eleanor had first met Reverend Walsh. Clara served as her bridesmaid, and Sheriff Dawson stood up as Carter's best man. All of Eleanor's students attended, along with what seemed like half the town, and Mrs. Patterson cried openly throughout the ceremony. Eleanor wore a simple cream-colored dress that she and Clara had spent weeks sewing, and Carter wore his best suit with his hair slicked back, and a look on his face like he could not quite believe his good fortune. "I, Eleanor, take you, Carter, to be my husband," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do us part." When Carter slid the ring onto her finger, Eleanor felt something settle inside her, a sense of rightness that she had never experienced before. This was home. Not Philadelphia, not Redemption Creek, but this man who looked at her like she hung the moon and stars. They moved into a small house that Carter had been building in secret for months. A sturdy cabin on the edge of town with 2 rooms and a sleeping loft and windows that looked out toward the mountains. It was not grand, but it was theirs, and Eleanor loved every rough-hewn beam and hand-planed board. The first year of their marriage was not easy. Carter's salary from the ranch was modest, and Eleanor's teaching income helped but was not enough to provide more than the basics. They worked hard, saved carefully, and slowly transformed their cabin into a real home with curtains Eleanor sewed herself and furniture that Carter built during the long winter evenings. But there were joys, too. The first time Eleanor cooked a meal in her own kitchen, even though she burned the biscuits and oversalted the stew. The night Carter taught her to dance, spinning her around the cabin floor to music only they could hear. The morning she woke up to find snow falling outside their window, and Carter watching her with such tenderness that she had to kiss him just to keep from crying. The way they would lie in bed on Sunday mornings talking about their dreams for the future, about the life they were building together. In the spring of their second year together, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She waited to tell Carter until she was certain, and then she planned an elaborate dinner with all his favorite foods and waited until they had finished eating to quietly push a tiny pair of knitted booties across the table toward him. Carter stared at them for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he looked up at Eleanor with wonder in his eyes and said, "We are going to have a baby." "In November," Eleanor confirmed, her hands resting protectively over her still flat stomach. Carter was around the table in an instant, pulling her up into his arms and holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I am going to be a father," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Eleanor, we are going to be parents." The pregnancy was not easy. Eleanor was sick for months, so nauseated that she could barely keep food down, and there were days when she wondered if she would survive until the birth. But Carter was devoted, bringing her weak tea and dry toast, rubbing her aching back, reading to her in the evenings when she was too exhausted to keep her eyes open. And gradually, as her belly swelled and the baby began to move inside her, Eleanor found herself getting excited despite her fears. Their son was born on a cold November night in 1885, after a labor that lasted 16 hours and left Eleanor certain she was going to die. But when Doc Bradley finally placed the squalling, red-faced infant in her arms, all the pain and fear evaporated like morning mist. He was perfect, absolutely perfect, with a shock of dark hair and Carter's brown eyes and tiny fists that waved in the air as though he was already fighting the world. "What should we call him?" Carter asked, his voice hoarse as he sat on the edge of the bed and touched their son's tiny hand with one calloused finger. "James," Eleanor said immediately, "after his father." Carter's eyes filled with tears and he leaned down to kiss Eleanor's forehead. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for him, for this, for everything." Little James was a good baby, healthy and strong, and Eleanor threw herself into motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else. She took a year away from teaching to care for him, and those months passed in a blur of feeding and rocking and marveling at every tiny milestone. Carter was a devoted father, coming home from the ranch each evening and immediately reaching for his son, playing with him and singing to him and making Eleanor's heart ache with love for both of them. When James was a year old, Eleanor returned to teaching part-time, and Mrs. Patterson, who had become like a mother to both of them, offered to watch the baby during school hours. It was not a perfect arrangement, but it worked, and Eleanor found that she had missed her students more than she realized. 2 years later, their daughter was born, a tiny, delicate girl with Eleanor's chestnut hair and a will of iron that became apparent within days of her birth. They named her Rose, and Carter doted on her even more than he had on James, if that was possible. Eleanor would often find him in the rocking chair at 2 in the morning with Rose asleep on his chest, and when she asked him what he was doing up, he would just smile and say he was memorizing the moment. Life in Redemption Creek continued to evolve around them. The town grew slowly but steadily, adding a second general store, a proper hotel, and even a small library that Eleanor helped establish using books donated from families throughout the county. The school expanded to 2 rooms, and Eleanor hired a young assistant teacher named Margaret who reminded her of herself at 21, full of idealism and determination. Carter left the cattle ranch when James was 5 and started his own business breaking and training horses. It was risky, and the first year was lean, but gradually his reputation spread, and people began bringing him horses from as far away as Montana and Colorado. Eleanor was fiercely proud of him, of the way he had built something from nothing through sheer hard work and determination. On their 10th anniversary, Carter surprised Eleanor with a trip to the high meadows he had promised her so many years ago. They left the children with Mrs. Patterson, who was now in her 70s but still formidable, and rode up into the mountains on a perfect July morning. When they reached the meadow, Eleanor understood why Carter had wanted her to see it. Wildflowers stretched as far as the eye could see, a carpet of purple and yellow and red that seemed to glow in the mountain sunlight. It was worth the wait, Eleanor said, standing in the middle of all that beauty with her hand in Carter's. You were worth the wait, Carter replied, pulling her close. Everything good in my life started the day you stepped off that train with your worn suitcase and your stubborn pride. I would wait 100 lifetimes for you, Eleanor Cartwright. They made love in the meadow surrounded by wildflowers, and Eleanor thought about how far she had come from that frightened, angry woman who had arrived in Redemption Creek with nothing but $27 and a desperate hope for something better. She had found so much more than she ever dreamed possible. She had found a home, a purpose, a family, and a love that grew stronger with every passing year. Their family continued to grow. 3 years after Rose came another son, whom they named Thomas, and 2 years after that, twin girls they called Alice and Margaret. Their little cabin was far too small for 7 people, so Carter built a larger house on the same piece of land, this one with 4 bedrooms and a real dining room and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Eleanor planted a garden that became the envy of the county, growing vegetables and herbs and flowers that bloomed from spring until the first frost. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books as much as his mother did, and showed an unexpected talent for drawing. Rose was fearless and adventurous, constantly coming home with skinned knees and wild stories. Thomas was gentle and loved animals, spending every spare moment helping his father with the horses. The twins were mischievous and inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and getting into elaborate schemes that drove Eleanor to distraction and made Carter laugh until he cried. Eleanor eventually stopped teaching to focus on her family, though she continued to serve on the school board and gave private tutoring lessons to students who needed extra help. Carter's horse training business thrived, and they were able to save enough money to buy a small piece of land outside town where they ran a few cattle and planted crops. It was not grand, but it was comfortable, and Eleanor never forgot how close she had come to losing everything. The years passed quickly, marked by birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments that Eleanor learned to treasure. Family dinners where everyone talked over each other, and the noise level made her ears ring. Evenings on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains while Carter held her hand. Sunday mornings at church, trying to keep the children quiet during Reverend Walsh's sermons. Summer picnics by the creek where the children splashed and played while Eleanor and Carter sat on a blanket and marveled at the life they had built. There were hard times too. A drought that nearly ruined them when Eleanor was pregnant with the twins, forcing them to slaughter half their cattle and take out loans that took years to repay. The terrifying week when Rose came down with scarlet fever and Eleanor sat by her bedside night and day, praying desperately for her daughter's life. The grief of losing Mrs. Patterson when Eleanor was 42, saying goodbye to the woman who had been like a mother to them both. But through it all, Eleanor and Carter remained constant. They argued sometimes, of course, about money and child-rearing and whose turn it was to deal with whatever crisis James or Rose or the twins had created. But they never went to bed angry, and they never stopped choosing each other, day after day, year after year. On a summer evening in 1910, Eleanor sat on the porch of their house watching the sun paint the mountains gold and pink. She was 52 years old, her hair was more gray than brown, and her hands bore the marks of decades of hard work. Carter sat beside her, his own hair silver, his face deeply lined from years of working outdoors. They were holding hands, their fingers intertwined with the ease of long practice. "Do you ever regret it?" Carter asked suddenly. "Coming west, marrying me, all of it. You could have had an easier life back east." Eleanor turned to look at him, this man who had carried her suitcase home through the snow 26 years ago, who had loved her through joy and sorrow and everything in between. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "You gave me everything I never knew I wanted, a real home, a family, a purpose, a love that has lasted more than half my lifetime. How could I possibly regret that, inside the house, They could hear the sounds of their adult children and grandchildren gathering for Sunday dinner. James had married a teacher from Denver and had given them 2 grandsons. Rose had shocked everyone by refusing to marry and instead opening her own dress shop in town, but she was happy and successful, and that was all Eleanor cared about. Thomas had taken over the horse training business from Carter and was making a good living at it. The twins had both married ranchers and lived nearby, and between them had produced 4 more grandchildren who kept Eleanor busy with babysitting and baking. 26 years, Carter mused. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like I have loved you for 1,000 years. Probably closer to 1,000, Eleanor teased, squeezing his hand. You were already half in love with me when you carried my suitcase, admit it. Carter laughed, the sound as warm and comforting as it had been the first time she heard it. Guilty as charged. You looked so fierce and so lost all at once. I knew right then that you were going to be important to me, I just did not know how important. Rose appeared in the doorway, her face flushed from the heat of the kitchen. Mama, Papa, dinner is ready. Stop being romantic and come eat before everything gets cold. Eleanor and Carter stood up slowly, their joints protesting after sitting for so long, and made their way inside to where 3 generations of Cartwrights waited around the big dining table Carter had built with his own hands. As Eleanor looked around at all those beloved faces, at the family she and Carter had created together, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for that cold December day when she had stepped off a train in Redemption Creek with nothing but a worn suitcase and a desperate hope. She had arrived on the last train of winter, and a cowboy had carried her suitcase home. That simple act of kindness had changed the trajectory of both their lives, had led them to this moment of perfect contentment surrounded by love and laughter, and the knowledge that they had built something lasting and good. After dinner, after the dishes were washed and the grandchildren were tucked into beds throughout the house, Eleanor and Carter returned to their porch and their familiar spot side by side. The stars were coming out, just as bright and numerous as they had been that first night when Eleanor admitted she had never seen anything like them. Still beautiful, Carter observed, following her gaze upward. Still beautiful, Eleanor agreed, but she was not looking at the stars. She was looking at her husband, at the man who had seen past her pride and fear to the woman underneath, who had loved her patiently until she was ready to love him back, who had built her a home and given her a family and never once made her regret choosing him. I love you, she said, words she had spoken thousands of times but which never lost their meaning. I love you too, Carter replied, pulling her close, until my last breath and beyond. They sat there in the gathering darkness, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that exceeded their wildest dreams. The West had been wild once, full of danger and uncertainty, but they had tamed their little corner of it and made it their own. And it had all started with a worn suitcase, a snowy platform, and a cowboy who saw a woman in need and decided to help. As the years continued to pass, Eleanor and Carter grew old together with the grace and acceptance of people who had truly lived. They celebrated their golden anniversary in 1931, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. And Eleanor looked at Carter across the cake-laden table and marveled that 50 years could pass so quickly, and yet feel so full. Carter died peacefully in his sleep 2 years later at the age of 74, and Eleanor held his hand as he took his last breath, whispering all the things she had said before but needed to say one more time. She grieved him deeply but not desperately, because she had been blessed with more love than most people ever found, and she would be grateful for that for whatever time remained to her. Eleanor lived another 6 years, surrounded always by family, and when she died at the age of 78, she was buried next to Carter in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Redemption Creek. Her gravestone reads simply, Eleanor Cartwright, beloved wife and mother, teacher and friend, she arrived on the last train of winter. And on Carter's stone, which James had commissioned after his father's death, were words that Eleanor had said to Carter on their wedding night and many times since. "You carried me home.